Hello everyone and welcome back to Classic Dune. And today I wanted to talk about something a little bit different, not the board game mechanically wise, but I wanted to talk about the lore of it. Dune is definitely one of the most thematic board games out there, and I would say it's probably the most thematic board game. And since every game of Dune is kind of like your own non-canon recreation of events, a new timeline, the ultimate question is going to be what's the lore of the world like in that particular game of Dune? And this especially changes when you look at the fact that now, after three expansions, you could still only play up to six factions, but now we have 12 to choose from. And so, if you factor in, a six-person game, you start to have these things where maybe, House Rishas and Ikaz and Moritani are in the game, but these really pivotal factions like the Atreides and the Harkonnen or even the Fremen aren't. And while I don't think the factions were chosen to be included with a thorough lore reasoning for it, I mean, you look at House Moritani, who for various reasons theoretically could not be in the board game if it was perfectly accurate. But I kind of wanted to speculate and theorize on why certain factions might be in a game of Dune and why they might not be. Since I've read all of Frank's books and almost all of the Brian books, but definitely all the ones in that 30 years leading up to Dune. So I think there's a lot of information that you could glean from those books to try to justify various factions' inclusions. Um, so this is definitely not the video to watch if you're worried about spoilers, but I will try to mention the book I'm going to talk about before I say any pertinent details. But definitely, if you're going to watch this, you're going to have to accept some measure of spoilers if you haven't read all of the books. So let's go ahead and start off with Atreides. Now, most of these factions I think will fall somewhere along a spectrum of they're a very active participant in Dune, and so you have to give reasons why they might not be in a game. And then there's other factions on the complete other end where they're usually very passive in lore, and you have to justify why they would be in a game. Atreides is a little bit of a weird faction here because, I mean, A, they're the reason why everything in the Dune universe happens after the first book, but also their leader setup is a little bit interesting. So we've got Paul as the faction leader, so he is the Duke, and there is no Leto. He's already dead or gone or something. And we also have Duncan alive, which by the end of the first book is not the case, and even Dr. Yui, who is still a trusted member of House Atreides. So I think if they're not in the game, I think there's a very easy justification for this, and it's that the Harkonnen slash Emperor plot has succeeded, and House Atreides is no more. They've been wiped off the face of Arrakis, and well, there's no story to tell because there's no one left. No military, no leaders, no retainers, nothing. But if they are in a game, I think there's definitely a very interesting alternate universe. And the way I think I see it based on the leaders alive and not, this is a world where Dr. Yui doesn't betray the Atreides. And this solves a lot of problems. A, he doesn't give up Paul and Jessica and Leto, and B, he also doesn't disable the house shields, which is going to allow the Atreides to basically be at their full strength, all 10 forces in Arrakeen, because if the house shields is up, they're basically going to be unassailable. It's just there's one problem is how do we end up in a universe where Leto is dead or not there, but everything else is okay and Yui hasn't betrayed House Atreides. And I think I see this as Leto, either giving himself up or sacrificing himself in some situation where he dies, and because of that, House Atreides can go on a little longer and try to survive and make something on Arrakis. And I think this is pretty easy to justify because even in the first book, you see a Leto who is he's basically staking his entire house on becoming one of the most powerful houses in the entire Imperium, and he's doing it for Paul. And you can even see he's a little bit pessimistic in some areas of the first book where he's realizing that he's thinking absent-mindedly about what's Paul going to do after he's gone. He's already sort of accepted the fact that sooner or later he's probably going to meet his end on Arrakis. And in the Kaladin trilogy, which leads up from 3 years before Dune, I think it is, maybe it's only one, to directly into the start of the first book, we see Alito who is starting to engage more in the politics of the Imperium to try to build a greater legacy for Paul. He doesn't want him to just have Caladan, this pretty insignificant planet. He wants him to have something better, right? And so that kind of ties into him giving more favor in the Landsraad, and eventually the Emperor looks to him to take control of Arrakis for, of course, the plot that we all know about. So I think it's definitely very easy to see a world where, House Atreides sticks together, Yui doesn't betray them, Duncan doesn't have to sacrifice himself, but ultimately somebody's got to die, and that person ends up being Leto, and then Atreides has the bulk of Paul has the bulk of the Atreides military in Arrakeen, safe and sound for the moment, and now they just gotta harvest the spice, take control of strongholds, and basically make themselves militarily the uncontested governors of Arrakis. And that's another thing to mention that I didn't is any faction in Dune that is in a game of Dune inevitably has to be doing things militaristically. The Tleilaxu, or actually the Bene Gesserit are a better example. They're very relevant to what goes on in Dune, but in the first book, yeah, even the second and third, they're not. They don't have a standing army. They're not sending people into battles and killing people and fighting. They don't do that, but they're still very relevant. But if they're in a game of Dune, there's no getting around it. Unless you're a really skilled BG player with the prediction, you can't win without sending forces to the board and fighting people. So while there are factions who would be impactful, if they're in the game, they have to be fighting. So you got to justify that somehow. Now, House Harkonnen, they're another pretty ubiquitous faction in the first book. They're a major driving force behind events. So if they're in a game of Dune, I think it's safe to say that um, they've probably not agreed with the Emperor's uh, taking Arrakis from House Harkonnen and implanting House Atreides instead. I think they're definitely either that plan hasn't taken place or the Harkonnens are protesting it. And they're digging their heels in Carthage, which in the book is their stronghold. That's their base of operations. And contrary to what the movie says, Arrakeen is actually pretty not insignificant, but Carthage is the major capital. It's got a lot of the infrastructure, a lot of the defenses, and that is where Raban or the Baron would have been ruling Arrakis from. It wasn't Arrakeen. That was Leto's choice when he moved to Arrakis. So if they're in the game of Dune, maybe Atreides aren't, and they've gone through with the plot with the Emperor, and they've completely wiped out House Atreides. And that's why they're on the board, and that's why the Atreides aren't. If the Atreides are in play, and the Harkonnen are as well, then I think that the Yui not betraying House Atreides storyline also makes sense. Basically, the House Shields haven't gone down, and the Harkonnens, they can't do their full-scale military attack against the Atreides, so instead, they take all those forces that they paid, what was it, like 80 years of spice harvesting to pay for the guild, and they stick them in Carthage instead, and they dig their heels in, and they kind of see to wait what happens. That's what I see, more or less. And I think in that case, the Emperor pulls his Sardaukar. He says, well, hey, if you can't make the attack on Arrakeen, then my Sardaukar are coming back, can't risk them being discovered, and what have you. If they're not in the game, I think this is really interesting. I think if they're not in a game of Dune, depending on whether or not the Atreides are in, there's probably some sort of they've attacked the Atreides anyways, and again, Yui doesn't betray them, and the Harkonnens get wiped out. It's like a horrible loss for them, and definitely that would definitely mean House Harkonnen is gone, completely irrelevant, because even if the Baron and Raban and all those other members of House Harkonnen survive this botched attack, the Emperor would probably have them executed, since they know all the details about the plan to have the Sardaukar bolstering the Harkonnens' military. So if they make an attack on the Atreides and it fails, I think House Harkonnen's completely wiped off the map, and that's why they wouldn't be in the game. If Atreides also aren't, then maybe this is a case where, maybe there is no Sardaukar. The Emperor hasn't been able to provide that for the Harkonnens, or for whatever reason, the Atreides are a more formidable threat than the Harkonnens were expecting. Maybe by this point, they've been able to strike an alliance with the Fremen, and now they've got Fremen forces helping them. And whatever the case may be, the Atreides and the Harkonnen clash, and they both wipe each other out. It's complete, Pyrrhic victory. Maybe the Harkonnens narrowly beat the Atreides, but it's just such a devastating defeat that they're so weak now that the Emperor could basically go, all right, well, you've taken care of my enemies for me, and you're not strong enough to stand up to me anymore, so I'm going to clean house, and again, make sure that that secret of the Sardaukar helping the Harkonnens is not going to get out. So he basically kills them all as well. And I think this is a really interesting world if House Atreides and House Harkonnen, as far as the books are concerned, two of the most important great houses in the entire Imperium are just gone, wiped off the map. They definitely have to have a new great house come in to mine the spice. So it's an interesting question who that might be. Next up is the Fremen, and I think the Fremen could actually go either way. So as we learn in Princess of Dune, this most recent Brian Herbert book to come out, we see that Liet, we all know Liet has a fair amount of control over the Fremen. He's basically their de facto leader. As far as the ones we hear about in the first book are concerned, they all treat him as their leader. They call him Liet. And we see that Liet is basically, he wants the Fremen to be more passive. He knows that they're terraforming Arrakis, and it doesn't really matter what House Harkonnen or whatever house replaces them does. Because at the end of the day, in a couple decades or maybe even centuries, they will have terraformed the southern hemisphere of Arrakis to accomplish their end goal. And that would give them a lot of leverage because, again, he who controls the thing can destroy it. He who can destroy a thing has the real control of it. I got that backwards. But essentially, if the Fremen are able to terraform the southern hemisphere, they can expand that to the northern hemisphere, and if there's no desert, there's no worms, which means there's no spice. So that would give the Fremen a major bargaining chip, is to basically say, you have to give us control of Arrakis, or we turn the whole thing green and there's no more spice. So that's, I think, theoretically Liet's idea is want to terraform Arrakis, not make any waves, don't draw any attention to the Fremen, and just be able to do what they're doing on the southern hemisphere without the Harkonnens attacking them too heavily. Of course, we also see that many of the other Fremen see it the other way around. They want to, attack the Harkonnen and show them who's boss, right? And not make their lives very easy. Of course, this doesn't really work out because they did the same thing to House Rishas, and when House Rishas, who were the old governors of Arrakis, the old people in charge of harvesting the spice, when their production just basically halted completely, they were ousted and the Harkonnens put in charge instead. So I think Leto sees that they need to balance these two things. And in a game of Dune where the Fremen are not involved, they're not in play, I see Liet getting his way. He basically gets all the Fremen to agree. Maybe there's some minor attacks here and there, but they're going to play the long game. They're going to be passive. And that's why you're going to have factions able to occupy Sietch Tabr and Habanya Sietch, and there's no Fremen picking them off one by one or anything like that. Basically, the Fremen are passive. They're terraforming Arrakis and doing nothing else. I think if they are in a game of Dune, clearly Liet hasn't been ousted from power and the Fremen are doing their own thing. But I think he's to a certain extent giving in to the demands of the Naibs and the Fremen at large and saying, "Hey, I'm still going to be your leader, but I guess we're going to take things on militaristically. We're going to take a more aggressive stance to controlling these strongholds and being more aggressive with the terraforming. Because, of course, if the Fremen can control a majority of Arrakis militarily and kick everyone else off the planet, it's going to be a lot easier for them to terraform the planet, and they'll be able to do it a lot faster. So, either way, Liet is in charge of the Fremen, but it's just a matter of how passive he's able to keep them, how much he's able to rein in the Fremen and their bloodlust and whatnot, and the desire to kick the offworlders off Arrakis. The Emperor is pretty interesting here because while they are, a base game faction and it does seem to make a lot of sense why the Emperor would be on Arrakis fighting people, it's actually kind of goes against a lot of things in Dune because this whole tripod of power, it basically functions with the Emperor, the Landsraad, and the Spacing Guild. The Emperor can take on any single faction head to head and come out on top because of his Sardaukar legions. But, of course, if he were to do that and the Landsraad at large to know about it, they would all collapse on him and fight him, and there's no way the Emperor is winning a war against a large majority of the houses of the Landsraad. So they kind of got a game of chicken going. Neither can attack the other without a huge war that nobody wins from. And then, of course, there's a Spacing Guild there. The Emperor can't really take charge and give all the power to himself, because then the Spacing Guild will not supply him with shipping privileges. So the Emperor has to divide his power among the Landsraad to keep the Spacing Guild happy, and he's got to do that, otherwise the Landsraad aren't going to be happy. Very weird situation, a bit of a standoff. Now, if the Emperor does come and put forces on Arrakis, nobody's going to be happy because it's going to be a threat to the Landsraad and it's going to be a threat to the Spacing Guild. So why is this, legal? Well, I think I see it as one of two things. Either the main political factions that aren't great houses are coming to Arrakis and trying to take control of it. So you got the Guild, the Bene Gesserit, the Tleilaxu, the Chom. These are all major powers in the Imperium, but none of them are great houses themselves. If they are all moving in on Arrakis and trying to take some power for themselves, I think the Landsraad would push the Emperor to go in and fight for their interests. Or either that or the Emperor would see it as justified. But either way, the major non-great house powers in the Imperium are making waves on Arrakis. The other way would be is if it's the opposite. It's all the great houses doing the same thing. So you've got basically everyone else. So all these great houses, if they're making moves on Arrakis, trying to take power for themselves, trying to harvest spice, and be the owners of Arrakis, I think now that gives the Emperor justification to make a move and militarily try to control Arrakis and bring some stability back to the Imperium. So it's either of these two things or a combination, but essentially 5 other factions are taking up military action on Arrakis, and there's no way the Emperor is going to let that stand. Now, why would the Emperor perhaps not be involved in a game of Dune? I see that as they've been severely weakened politically. So in the House trilogy of books, there's a lot of things going on, but one of the big things is the Amal Project, which is basically the Emperor working with the Tleilaxu to create a synthetic alternative to spice. Basically a spice that they can produce by themselves without having anything to do with Arrakis or worms or anything like that. which would be huge if it was under the Emperor's control, because that gives him just de facto control. He doesn't need to delegate one great house to harvest spice on Arrakis, and it also breaks that monopoly of making Arrakis the most important planet in the Imperium. It would be a major political bargaining chip for the Emperor if he had that under his control. And of course, since we know that doesn't happen, we know that somewhere down along the line, this Amal project gets screwed up, and it doesn't cause any blowback on the Tleilaxu or the Emperor, from what I remember. But if it did, if it got out that the Emperor was trying to create a synthetic spice, I think that would majorly kneecap their political influence. Basically, the great houses would say, how can we trust this Emperor that's literally trying to cut us out of the business? They're trying to, like, this status quo of a great house controlling Arrakis and having a contract to mine spice for the rest of the Imperium, it's been in place for like thousands of years. I'm not sure when exactly after the Butlerian Jihad this praxis is instituted, but essentially this is the status quo for as long as anyone can remember. And so the Emperor now trying to change that, getting caught red-handed, and it not working. This is basically an Emperor who probably holds power in name only. He's the Emperor, but he doesn't wield any power. Nobody's listening to him. And maybe he's even been blockaded on Kaitane. They've got a Landsrat fleet in orbit, and they're saying, hey, if you make any moves, you're gonna be holding a throne on a nuclear wasteland. That's the way I see it. And it's tough to justify this because the Emperor is such a major player, and Emperor Shaddam IV, he's a very greedy person. He wants to be in charge. And so there's no way, with the circumstances as they are when Dune starts, there's no way that same Emperor would just let things happen on Arrakis, let 6 other major powers fight it out without him himself being involved. So there's definitely some sort of political scandal that's come to light that's basically removed all of his influence. The Guild is actually a pretty interesting one here. They're not really the Guild so much as they are, in my opinion, the smugglers with the support of Edric. Now, this is a very minor spoiler for Dune Messiah because it's revealed in like the 2nd chapter or something. But basically, Edric is involved in this conspiracy against House Atreides. So we can see that Edric is not one to bending the rules in search of greater power. He wasn't much of a big player in that conspiracy, but it did really show that he doesn't mind getting his hands a little dirty. So I kind of see this as Edric leading, a splinter of the Spacing Guild and backing the smugglers. So the smugglers, they've got military, but with a little bit of guild support, now they're able to do a lot of things. Which I think also could show why the Spacing Guild isn't immediately super rich. They start with 5 spice, which is the 2nd lowest of all the base game factions. It's only like BG they're tied with, and Fremen has less. They got 3. So why are they not that rich? Well, it's probably just whatever the smugglers themselves already have. And everything after that is income paid to the guild that Edric is now redirecting to the smugglers' pockets. So this is the smugglers, and they're called the Spacing Guild because Edric is giving them support to be able to, cross ship and get income and all that. And then if at the end of turn 10 nobody's won, the guild wins because the status quo is maintained, so they can give the smugglers some power, what have you. But this is definitely not the Spacing Guild at large, and it really is only because Edric is the only named navigator in all the 6 books, I think. 6 Frank Herbert books. But it is a neat coincidence that he's such a tricksy, kind of conspiring person. And so that's probably why he's leading the Spacing Guild faction and not whoever's in charge of the entire guild at large. It's tough to say though, because there's not a lot of info on the power structure of the Spacing Guild. Is there some, guild emperor or guild CEO or some super navigator? Not really sure. But in any event, they're led by one specific guild navigator, and it's Edric, and I don't think he's any stranger to doing things under the table. Now, if the guild aren't in the game of Dune, well, that's a really easy question to answer. They're just the guild. They're not doing anything. They're not intervening because that's the guild's thing. They don't like to intervene. They don't want to put their neck out on the line, and that makes perfect sense. So, guild not in the game, very easy to justify. Now I got the BG, and this is a really tough one, and I'm not really sure how much of a concrete justification I could give for them being in the game because, when in the first few books does the Bene Gesserit have an army and they're going in and fighting battles? I can't really think of anything. So I think I sort of see this as they're trying to act as a foil to Paul. So let's say the Atreides are in the game. He is a potential candidate for being the Kwisatz Haderach. So if he is able to, with his prescience, control Arrakis, especially in a case where they have not suffered a horrible defeat, they've got all their military power, they're stuck in Arrakeen, and they've got Paul leading them, I think that's a genuine concern for the Bene Gesserit, much more so than what actually happens in the book, where he escapes to the Fremen. Because he could conceivably take control of Arrakis by himself, and it would be very public, because one of the main reasons why Paul succeeded with controlling the Fremen and leading them to victory was because nobody really knew what was going on until it was too late. But if Paul is leading House Atreides on Arrakis, he's got major military power. He's still got political power because, again, the Atreides are well liked. They've got a good relationship with House Ikaz and House Vernius, and even to a very slight extent House Rishes, because there's a blood relation there. There's some family members connected. They're a very well liked house, and if they're not wiped out off the map, they can pull some favors. They've got military, and of course they've got Paul's prescience. I think in this case, the Bene Gesserit might be inclined to in some way intervene militarily and act as a foil. Some way to make sure that he can't take control of Arrakis all by himself. How the Bene Gesserit would ever get into a situation where they do the equivalent of a solo victory, it's tough to say. That makes a lot of sense. It's a bit up in the air because, again, the Bene Gesserit aren't known for having a military. They probably do in some form. It's like one Bene Gesserit soldier is the equivalent to like 10 regular soldiers, something like that, because they're definitely not fielding huge legions of troops and whatnot. But it just doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and I can't even really try to justify it other than some niche cases and definitely some mental gymnastics. If they're not in the game, it's just like the guild, very easy to justify. They're just letting things play out and they're controlling things from the background. That's very BG, definitely in keeping with their MO. So that's an easy question to answer. And now we come to the Tleilaxu, and this is definitely an answer that's going to rely a lot on the house books and a little bit on the recent Princess to Dune book. Basically, the Tleilaxu, they want to be in control. They want to have greater political influence, but for many reasons, they're shunned. They're on the outskirts. Nobody really likes them. And they really only have influence because they provide these services which are valuable, but kind of a little bit gross. They deal with dead bodies and dead people, and it's a bit of an optics issue if you were to be associating yourself too closely with the Tleilaxu. So they provide not a necessary service, but a very useful one. They're not like the Ixians where, they provide a lot of very useful technology. You could probably live without Golas and biological arm, leg, organ replacements. Could function without it, but if you do business with the Tleilaxu, it's very useful. they're on the fringes of imperial politics, but they want to have that greater control, and they've had a lot of schemes to do so. So, in the house books, they've got, of course, as I mentioned, the Amal Project, a synthetic spice, which, if they ally with the Emperor to make that happen, that's a major political boon for the Tleilaxu. You also have in the Kaladin trilogy, they have Alar, which is this drug that they are growing on Caladan, and it's basically a major. It's illegal drugs. They're growing illegal drugs and they're selling them and they're getting people hooked on it, and it's a major revenue source under the table, off the books for the Tleilaxu, which seems to me like they're trying to make a lot of money to basically buy their way into political favor. And then, yet again, another scheme, that one doesn't go very well. The ALR project gets shut down. They've got another one in Princess of Dune, which is they are trying to make their own Gola synthetic navigators. So there's this whole thing where when a Spacing Guild navigator dies, they actually take the body to Arrakis and they bury it on a pre-spice mass, and then when the spice blow occurs, it basically, destroys the evidence. So it's safe to do. But essentially, they take the bodies and they bury them on Arrakis. Through some way or another, the Tleilaxu find out about this, and they are able to steal the dead body of a navigator, and they start running experiments on it in a hidden lab, and they're trying to clone guild navigators, which again, if the Tleilaxu could provide their own navigators, they don't need to know the secret of how to create one with spice. Basically, they've already got them. They can clone them. That's huge because now they could just sell them to, for example, the Ixians, who are the ones who actually construct the Guild Highliners with the Spacefold engines. They can just sell navigators to people. Major political boon. They could basically make the guild irrelevant because they can break that monopoly on space travel. So the Tleilaxu, they're very ambitious. They want to get, they want to get their head in the game. They want to be relevant to the imperial politics. And when all these projects fail for one reason or another, I think I could definitely see them taking to military action. We don't see in the first few books any signs of Tleilaxu military, but it's very easy to justify because, again, they got their hands on cells of Duncan, Idaho. It's definitely a thing they do where they collect genetic material from legendary soldiers or even just regular soldiers and clone them. So they probably have got their own Gola army of very skilled warriors. So the Tleilaxu being militarily involved on Arrakis, very easy to do for them and also very easy to motivate for them. If they're not involved, I think on one hand you could just say it's like the Bene Gesserit or like the Guild where they don't get themselves involved. But I think we can go a step further and just say that because of all these failed projects, let's say they get revealed publicly that they were trying to do these things, that's going to impose some heavy, maybe trade tariffs or trade embargoes, or maybe it's even justification enough for the Landsraad or the Emperor to wipe them out entirely. Or maybe if this cloned Guild Navigator project, if the fallout on that is real bad, maybe the Spacing Guild cuts them out of the Imperium altogether and just says, hey, no Guild Highliners are going to be going to Tleilax. So you could just say they're being their typical passive selves, but I like to think that they've had some political blunders and they're completely out of the game. The Ixians. I think of all the factions here to be militarily involved on Arrakis, I think the Ixians have the next best case after the base 6 factions. Which is because the Ixians are no strangers to being on Arrakis. Basically, in the house books, they get their homeworld invaded by the Tleilaxu and occupied. And their leader, Earl Dominic Vernius, he goes off into hiding, he becomes a renegade, and he actually goes to Arrakis and sets up a little smuggling operation on the southern hemisphere. He sets up a hidden stronghold on the South Pole, which is apparently where the whole hidden mobile stronghold comes from, with a couple liberties taken in terms of it being hidden and mobile. But essentially, the Ixians did have a small operation set up on Arrakis, and eventually, with the help of House Atreides, they take back their homeworld of Ix. Now, in the, I think, let's say 5 years leading up to Dune, the Ixians are actually on a bit of a precipice. They're at the halfway point between two potential futures. On one hand, you have House Vernius, who control Ix, and they are a great house like any other. They build technology, but they're also starting to slip towards what we know as the Ixians in the later books, the Ixian technocracy. Basically, this Technocrats Council is gaining more political power relative to the Great House of House Vernius, and in the Dune canon, this technocracy takes power after Earl Romber Vernius dies very tragically, and they now run things, and it's a technocracy like everyone knows in those later books, like God Emperor and what have you. But at the time of Dune, they are a great house, just like all the other ones. And so if Romber Vernius doesn't die, and he wants to get some more political power, he wants to have power that's separate from the technology that they produce to prevent the Technocrats Council from basically overwriting them. I think he tries to go to make a play for Arrakis to get some spice harvesting operations going on. And that would be a whole new source of political power that this Technocrat Council can't really touch because they deal in manufacturing and exporting tech, especially the Guild Highlanders. And if that's the Ixians' only claim to fame, then eventually the technocrats are gonna overwrite the Great House, and it's just gonna be a technocracy. But if Romber makes a play for Arrakis, he starts harvesting and exporting spice, and eventually controls it, much like the Atreides and the Harkonnen do. Then I think they go on and they continue to be a great house, House Vernius. Now, maybe this exists in that world where the Harkonnens and the Atreides basically attack each other and wipe each other out. Maybe in this scenario, House Vernius is the one that's chosen to harvest the spice as the quasi fief. I could definitely see that happening. If the other great houses are present on Arrakis, it definitely makes it a little bit more questionable why they are there. But I feel like there is definitely some major event that happens in this board game Dune universe for there to be justification for these factions to be fighting militaristically over Arrakis. Because in the Dune canon, it's pretty unheard of for there to be major full-scale warfare over Arrakis between multiple parties. The Atreides versus Harkonnen, the Battle of Arrakeen, that was like a flash in the pan. That happened in one night, and as far as the Imperium was concerned, House Atreides was gone, destroyed, and the Harkonnens were back under control. So really, it was just one small battle, and that's it. But this is warfare on Arrakis. Multiple battles. So there is definitely some event that made this reasonable. And I think whatever event that might be, it allows for House Vernius to come in to Arrakis and try to take a piece of the pie. And I mention this because a lot of these next few factions are great houses, which have no business fighting over Arrakis if we look at it in the perspective of the books. So something has happened. Who knows what it might be? But I think a good idea of what it might be is essentially in Dune, in the second half, the Harkonnen spice production has come to a standstill, and the Emperor comes to Arrakis with all his Sardaukar, but also a lot of the houses of the Landsraad come with him to basically if there's any power to be gained from what happens, to to stake their claim. So I think there's probably some sort of similar scenario where, for whatever reason, spice production goes down, maybe even to zero, and the Emperor comes to Arrakis, or maybe he doesn't, he's not relevant enough, but all these major players come to Arrakis to fight over it, and it's basically the turning point of the Imperium. It's never be the same since. Um, if the Ixians are not in a game of Dune, then I think what happens in regular Dune canon is pretty applicable. Romber Vernius dies. The House Vernius is irrelevant. It's the technocracy now, and they just keep to their own. They manufacture tech and sell it, and that gives them a major political foothold, and they're content with that, so they don't need to fight over Arrakis. All right, next up is CHOAM, and they are a major player in the Caladan trilogy. Essentially, it is revealed that key heads of houses in CHOAM are working together in what's called the Noble Commonwealth to overthrow the Emperor. And they're doing it slowly, here and there, bit by bit, over many years, covertly. They're not trying to get into open warfare. So if CHOAM is not in a game of Dune, I think it's fair to say that this Noble Commonwealth keeps doing what it's doing, not making waves, just pretending to be the corporation that moves all goods in the Imperium. But if they are on Arrakis, I think there's definitely a case for Jackson Aru, who is the son of the Ur-director Melina Aru. I think there's definitely the case where he has done some crazy things. So in the book, he really disagrees with his mother on this passive approach to overthrowing the Emperor. He starts basically public, right there out in the open, public rebellion. I think he does this. He opens Melina's eyes to the possibilities of open, outward attacks against the Emperor, against the Imperium, and he dies somehow. Spoilers, like he does in the book. However, instead of CHOAM kind of falling back behind the scenes, I think he accelerates their playbook and he makes them hire a standing army of mercenaries and try to claim Arrakis for themselves militarily, along with a lot of these major heads of great houses, like Duke Verdun, like Lord Londi. So that's CHOAM. It's a bit weird because they're not a great house. They're not a specific singular entity. They're kind of like the Landsraad. They're an organization of great houses, and so it's weird to see them all come together and have an army and fight over Arrakis. But I could definitely see it happening based on the events of the Caladan trilogy, with Jackson Aru having outward violence and attacks against the Imperium. And now we come to House Riches, and they are pretty irrelevant in the Dune canon. Basically, they used to control Arrakis, but after, repeated Fremen sabotage and mismanagement on the part of Count Ilben Riches, they fall to the wayside. They're very poor. They lose out a lot of major tech contracts to the Ixians. How do they come to start deploying troops militarily onto Arrakis? I honestly see it as people write off House Riches. They're declining. People expect them to maybe not even be a great house in a couple of years. But in one last-ditch effort to be relevant, to have some claim to fame, they come and they deploy forces. They start selling off some of their proprietary technology, as they do in the board game. Those, null entropy boxes and Samuda drugs and whatnot. They start selling off their assets to generate capital, and they send an army to Arrakis and they try to control it. Very similar to the Ixians, similar story. They want to control spice and control Arrakis and basically be more relevant. This one's a bit of a long shot though, just because like House Richesse, they're on their last legs. They've got they would have a real trouble being relevant in the Dune universe, and so this is probably the least likely of any faction to be actually taking up arms and attacking Arrakis. If they're not in the game, it's what happens in Dune. They're irrelevant. They lose out on major contracts, and their funds slowly whittle down to maybe no longer even being a great house anymore. That's the way I see it. Let's look at ECAS. ECAS, I think this one is actually pretty interesting. They're right up there with the Ixians in terms of being pretty justified in trying to control Arrakis militarily. Essentially, in the house books and also in Paul of Dune, the flashback sections of it, we see that House Ikaz is one of the most important, wealthy, and influential houses in the Imperium, which I think is shown with their ambassador ability. But the main thing is that Archduke Armand Ikaz, he's got only daughters, and so if his house is going to continue, he has to have a political marriage with another house, like we see in the house books, House Atreides. They try that twice, doesn't really work out. But safe to say that at the end of the day, they don't succeed at making a strategic political alliance, and I think they're a pretty rich house. They have ECAS, which is where a lot of the drugs and narcotics and medicines or poisons in the Imperium are sourced from. And so House ECAS is probably a fairly wealthy, great house, probably right up there with House Harkonnen. And so I definitely see them, all the political ways to victory are exhausted, and they go full military. They deploy in the Imperial Basin, and they stake their claim on Arrakis. If they aren't in a game of Dune, I would say that House Ikaz forges some favorable alliance with another house, some sort of political marriage. It's tough to say who it might be with. Hey, maybe it's with House Atreides, but then they die on Arrakis, as we all know, and that kind of sinks House Ikaz as well. In in the prequel books, House Ikaz, both of Armand Ikaz's daughters are, actually there's several others, but his daughters are essentially killed in assassination attempts by House Mortani. And so I think if they're not in a game of Dune, I think the most likely explanation is that House Ikaz and House Mortani, who've got a bitter rivalry with each other, have fought each other into insignificance. They've wiped each other out or something, or they've been wiped out by House Mortani. Something like that. But they fade into obscurity, and the house becomes part of some other one, either through marriage or through conquest. And last, but certainly, or maybe even least here, we've got House Mortani. And this one is another long shot because House Mortani, as of Dune in canon, spoilers for Paul of Dune, they are wiped out completely. They're gone. It's not even a House Risha situation where who knows how relevant they are, they just aren't mentioned. No, they made a play to kill the Emperor and it failed horribly, and every member of the house is dead, including Viscount Hundro Moritani. The only survivor is their swordmaster, He Resser, but who knows what happens to him. So, I mean, if they're not in a game of Dune, that's definitely what happened to them. That attempt against the Emperor failed and they were wiped out. If they are in a game of Dune, I think I would definitely have to say that this assassination attempt fails. Sorry, not fails. It never happens, because if it did go off, basically he tried to lure the Emperor to their homeworld of Grumman and detonate atomics to kill everyone, including the Emperor. So if their plan fails or succeeds, House Mortani is no more. It was basically a suicide attempt to destroy the Empire. So that's definitely not happening if they're in a game of Dune, because they have a military, they have leaders. So hasn't happened, and I think they're gonna probably try a similar play, but instead of on their homeworld of Grumman, they're gonna try it on Arrakis. They're gonna try to attack Arrakis, take control of it, harvest spice, and then either they succeed and their house is very rich because of it, or it forces the Emperor to intervene and Hanjo Moritani pulls off his stunt with atomics and blows up the Emperor and all that. That's what happens in my mind. But definitely, there's a lot of events of Paul of Dune and of the house books that do not happen if the Mauritani are going to be in any given game of Dune. And that is all the factions, kind of a little bit of analysis on what factors in lore, what historical events may have happened or not happened, or reasons for them to be irrelevant or not irrelevant. The Dune board game is a really interesting it's a really interesting sandbox for creating these alternate histories and alternate futures for Dune, just because of how free form it is. There's a lot of different events you can simulate. There's a lot of very evocative mechanics in like the traders and also in the faction abilities. And so that's why it's so great. And I hope that maybe you got a little bit of insight. If you haven't read the books and you don't really intend to, maybe you could go into a game, and once you know who your faction is, you can gauge a little bit more what the political climate of the world might have been at that time for all those factions to be involved, and kind of help with role playing a little bit. I'm not really a big role playing player. I don't, do voices or, speak in character or anything. But I do like to imagine the events of any given game of Dune being, what those would look like as a story in Dune, what could have been. So that's going to do it for now. I'm now going to rest my voice because, that was a lot of talking. But yeah, that's going to do it for now, and I will catch you guys later.